Hello there, so quick history lesson. The BAT split in 2014 made the BMap nomination group accessible to anyone. BN promotion began as voting paired with modding activity checks, then midway through 2015 that changed to an application-based system where QA team members would judge applicant modding samples. There were some problems with each of these. The voting method was clearly biased, letting those with connections receive higher chances of promotion, and both systems lacked a good way to assess modding competency. Because BN promotion was planned to shift towards an automated system eventually, it only made sense to try out a new, somewhat automated BN promotion system first. A system without biases that could reasonably assess applicant modding knowledge on an even playing field. Something familiar. The BMap nominator tests were literally standardized placement tests held between early 2016 and mid-2017. Applicants who surpassed a base modding activity threshold were given a two-part exam, the first half being multiple choice questions about nomination, and the second half being a written section where you just mod a map. Both would be run through an answer key, and those who made a minimum score could call themselves new BMap nominators. Testing mapping knowledge isn't exactly a revolutionary concept. I'm sure tons of mappers have pondered the idea before. While pondering was the limit for most people though, Charles 445 actually made it a reality with a project he called a modding puzzle. No stakes or prizes here, this was just a fun way to see how much modders knew about rankability. Charles designed a short map with 7 ranking criteria violations, and whoever found all of them would have their name written on the thread. Like this guy, you know him. Alongside those 7 rankability issues were some false positives too, as in weird mapping choices intended to trick people into thinking they were unrankable. Like the first 3 objects here break basic spacing logic used in most maps. These are 2 different rhythms visually spaced apart the same way. It sucks, but it's not technically unrankable, so it's not one of the 7 problems. This slider, however, is unrankable. The slider reverses on itself a tiny amount, and while it's not a big deal, it does go against the ranking criteria and therefore is one of the 7. So yeah, a few weeks after it launched, Charles explained the unrankable issues and tricks publicly, letting anyone test themselves if they so desired. Turned out to be a pretty cool project in my opinion, and while it clearly wasn't too serious, it may have been the foundation on which BN tests half a year later were built. Not coincidentally, the first BN test's practical portion was mainly designed by Charles too, but it was drastically different from his old modding puzzle. Rather than only testing basic ranking criteria info, it was supposed to assess a user's general modding knowledge, so it included a variety of mapping problems. Some were significant, like sliders being unreadable, or reverses being glitched out to face the wrong way. Other problems were more minor, like comboing mistakes or bad rhythm choices. BN test takers were supposed to point out both types, since that's what a real nominator would need to do if this were a map headed for rank. The more intended issues a test taker pointed out in their mod, the more points they'd earn, and those points dictated their admission to the BMap nomination group. To more accurately assess modder knowledge, the importance of issues also determined how many points people earned. Makes sense, right? If a BN promotes a map with huge problems, they'd be in trouble, where if they promoted a map with a faulty new combo, no harm done. And lastly, to make sure all bases were covered, the test consisted of 10 maps lasting 10 seconds apiece. Each varied in difficulty level, so modders needed to assess whether mapping was acceptable in context as well. For example, a short spinner recovery time is okay on an insane, but not on an easy. So that was the practical portion of the test. The multiple choice section wasn't as straightforward as what you might be thinking. Instead of being given the usual A, B, C, D selection, most questions were a prompt and a list of options, any number of which could be correct. Like, a sample question could be, whose maps must you nominate, with possible choices being pishifat's map sets with pishifat guess difficulties, anyone else's maps, and so on. Test takers would need to select all that applied, ensuring that they couldn't get lucky and guess a single right answer. That was fast, but that just about sums up how the first BN test worked. So how did this affect the nomination group? Anyone who passed the test could be a nominator. Anyone who failed the test could not. That's how it should have worked to ensure all nominators had a minimum skill level, but that would have also completely destroyed the ranking ecosystem. Along with new BN applicants, those who were nominators at the time were also required to take the test, and the majority of them completely failed. They weren't just 1 or 2 points off either, no. Some received scores that make it questionable as to how they became nominators in the first place. While plain incompetence was a factor for some people, I don't think it was the only one at play here. I think the main problem for most people was just a lack of preparedness. Nobody really knew what to expect from this test. It was required to point out a bunch of subjective issues that people probably didn't realize were worth mentioning until receiving one-on-one test result feedback afterwards. Knowing how the test worked and therefore what to look for might have contributed to the huge amount of people passing the second test. Charles 445 had quit OSU by this point, so a couple members of the QAT took over test creation with their own slight modifications. No longer was the test made of 10 random difficulty excerpts. It was a full map set now, consisting of 4 difficulties lasting about a minute each. According to a QAT interview, this was to make the BN test more realistic since people mod full sets usually, not 10-second bits. Really though, there's no way to make a test scenario feel realistic. People have spent upwards of, not even joking, 6 hours to mod these BN test sets just to make sure they catch everything. There's no way you do that when modding normally, and a real map wouldn't have so many obscure problems anyway, so I'm not too sure how much effect this change really had. But we got a background this time, so that's cool. Also, this test was noticeably easier than the first. I took home to becoming BN a second time and almost got 100% on the modding section, whereas I don't think I'd come even close to that if I took Charles' test around the same time. Other people showed similar results too. Most BNs who failed the previous test passed this one, and those who still couldn't do it were finally kicked. As for new applicants, 7 had passed the first test, while 22 passed the second. That led to a huge influx of new nominators, more than desired actually, which influenced even more modifications with the third test. If relative difficulty for each test were placed on a graph, the first would be around here, the second would be lower, and the third would be above both due to its more subtle issues and some experimental difficulty creation. Instead of sprinkling issues evenly throughout each of the 4 diffs, 2 were handled unevenly. One diff was garbage with issues almost everywhere, while another was practically rankable. Sounds like a weird choice, but I think it worked well to show how much modders really knew. One of the main problems seen in the last test was that there was no penalty for writing nonsense. People could criticize literally every object and not be marked down for it so long as they had the right stuff too. With uneven distribution of problems, however, those checking answers saw who could recognize good mapping and who just wrote BS to earn points, which reflected in the judge's impression section of scoring. I like this idea, but I wasn't too happy with the results of this test. There were only 6 new nominators this round, meaning the test might have been legitimately too hard. Luckily though, that was finally balanced out with the 4th test. The modding section of this test was pretty much perfect. Its style was the same as the last one, while the specific content wasn't too easy nor too hard. It tested exactly at the right level, though there were a couple subjective issues that I didn't really agree with. The multiple choice section surprisingly was what underwent innovation this time. Instead of being choose all that apply problems, the questions were fill in the blank related directly to the modding portion's map set. This system essentially made both sections into a practical modding test, the right direction in my opinion. Results were positive for this round too. About 10 new nominators passed, one of which even got 100% on both sections. I'd say this 4th test was one of the best so far. But then, why was it also the last one? There was one fatal flaw to this BN promotion system. It was impractical to contain. Before taking the BN test, modders are presented with statements like, you must do the test alone, don't make the questions public, and ignoring this stuff will disqualify you from being a BN. But aside from threats, what's really stopping people? When Charles's first test was sent to applicants, it spread to all active mappers within a day. That's how I got a hold of it. After the second BN test, I know tons of applicants who discuss their answers with each other, myself included. None of that is especially harmful, but what about cheating? What about people working together on the test and spreading answers to each other? That was the problem with BN tests for what should be obvious reasons. So, during this 4th test, mistakes were made. A fair number of people were caught involved in foul play, and it was decided that trying to prevent this in future tests just wasn't realistic. Regardless of threats, people would always break rules, and there was no surefire way to catch them. Ultimately, this experimental form of BN promotion that could assess modding skill was concluded because the overhead to prevent modding skill forgery was more than could be handled. That last test happened about 6 months ago. While testing may be discontinued now, I think it's made a lasting impact on nominators and mapping up to today. For one, a good portion of foreign nominators were pushed away during testing because of their subpar English skills. The multiple choice section was especially problematic in this regard, since misinterpretation of just one word can mean an entirely wrong answer. Even native speakers have had problems here actually. Wording sometimes left room for exceptions, so the right answers weren't always 100% valid. To pass this stuff, you really needed to know what you were reading, and foreigners couldn't really do that too well. More importantly than that, BN tests affected what nominators focus on while modding. I mean, that was their entire point. Before they existed, there were no solid modding standards. People just went by the ranking criteria, and whatever the QAT said was unrankable. BN tests, however, brought legitimacy to the subjective side of modding. People were promoted to nominators if they understood certain subjective ideas, and as BNs, they could continue to spread those ideas among mappers. It's like testing formed a consensus among nominators on mapping info, headed by a few members of the QAT. I have a feeling if BN tests hadn't existed, we might have seen a different side of ranked maps today. Whether that's positive or negative is impossible to say though. But yeah, that covers what I consider the most interesting phase of BN promotion. So what's to come with future BN promotion systems? That's, well, that might be the truly most interesting phase of BN promotion, just for completely different reasons. Better to talk about that when we know more though. Anyway, thanks for watching. Wait. Hi. It's been 3 weeks since I initially wrote the script for this video, and looking back on it now, just a couple days before publication, something about ending there seems lacking. BN tests are a sensitive subject because they've always been treated with secrecy, so I chose to cover this subject from a safe, mostly neutral perspective. What I'd consider the main appeal of this whole YouTube channel, however, is getting first-hand mapping knowledge from someone knee-deep in the mapping world, which basic historical preservation misses out on. So then, to really culminate this, what's my personal opinion on BN tests? The tests themselves, as in the maps and their design, are fun. A score on a test controlling your fate in the modding world is not fun. This hadn't affected me. I did fine on my test and made it into the nomination group. I do sympathize with the horror stories I've heard from people who weren't so fortunate though. The people turned away from becoming a BN after falling short of the threshold by 1 or 2 points, who when judged subjectively or on a less stringent metric, would be fine for the job. Risen comes to mind as one of the people worst off in this regard. He's taken all 4 BN tests and failed by a tiny amount each time. You could say, oh, he must not be good enough, and perhaps that's true, but it doesn't sit well with me anyway when I know there's parts of each test I don't agree with, and I'm sure there's other people who relate with him too. This honestly wouldn't be so bad if not for the wait between tests. Sitting around for 4 to 5 months to take another test you might not even pass in a game that most people don't stick around with for more than a couple years, no thanks. People fail the test, lose interest in modding, and fade away. Speaking from my own experience, being a nominator makes modding a lot more fun. In the time after I was kicked from the nomination group, I felt like my mods were insignificant, whereas being able to directly help out mappers by pushing them along in the ranking process felt infinitely more valuable. It also definitely didn't help that the first opportunity I had to rejoin the nominators was 8 months after my kick, a huge amount of what felt like unnecessary downtime. If given the opportunity to contribute as a nominator though, I'm sure tons of people who failed the test and got jaded by modding as a non-BN for months would stick around longer. Modders are in high demand, and being told you're not ready by 2 points on a test after working for 2 years just feels like a huge insult. But I mean, what can you really do? A lot of those points apply to other BN promotion systems too. There is no perfect BN promotion system, which is why it keeps changing. On one end, I feel nominators should be capable for the job, and on the other, I feel there's lots of people who want to contribute and therefore should. The BN test seemed like yet another attempt at this balancing act that didn't really work out. That's my thoughts on BN tests. So, I guess that concludes this addendum or whatever it's been. Thanks for watching, see you next week.